everyone, and welcome to the next video in our Endgame series. Now, it's been a minute, more like 6 months or so, since the last Endgame video came out. But my enthusiasm for the Endgame series and my desire to see it through to the end has not waned in the slightest. Most of you know that I wear many hats, and in the last couple of months, my commentary schedule got very hectic. I've been doing a lot of traveling, and I've also been pretty intensely working on my King's Indian course, which will hopefully come out this millennium. But now that I'm finally back home from Paris, where I commentated the live finals of the Speed Chess Championship, hopefully you were watching. Big shout out to the winner, some obscure guy named Magnus Carlsen. I think now is as good a time as any to push the series forward, especially because I'm armed to the teeth with some really cool material that I can't wait to share with all of you. And so without further ado, welcome to the second part of our Knight versus Pawn Endgame Practicum. Now, if you're new to the channel or you want a refresher on where we are in our Endgame journey, you can take a look at the Endgame playlist on my channel. But just very quickly, we're currently tackling Knight versus Pawn endgames, in which one side has a knight and or pawns, and the other side has just pawns. I've released a couple of videos on this type of endgame, including an introductory video that I'll link in the description below. You definitely want to make sure that you've seen that video because I introduce all of the key concepts and ideas and theoretical positions that will greatly help you in solving this and the next set of challenging exercises. We did part 1 of the Knight versus Pawns Endgame Practicum, in which you took the side of the pawns facing the knight. In this video, part 2, I give you 9 challenging exercises drawn from real-life games, but the roles are reversed. This time, you will have the knight, so the side with the knight, and you'll be facing a bloodthirsty army of pawns that has only one thought on their mind, and that is to tear the knight limb from limb, and your job will be to demonstrate the superiority of the horse. Very, very quick housekeeping before we jump into these exercises. In the description, apart from the introductory video, you will find 2 links to Lichess Studies. The first has just the exercises, if you want to download them or solve them before looking at this video. The second is the fully worked out solution file that has all of the solutions written out with text if you want to review the solutions in a more leisurely fashion. On the right side of your screen, just like in previous instances of the practicum, you will find a sort of smattering of key concepts that occur throughout this next set of exercises. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is meant as a general guide. This is meant to kind of guide your brain in the right direction and reinforce some of the reoccurring concepts to help you kind of see and establish the connections. One final cautionary note, these exercises are challenging. So this isn't just a kind of rote review of basic concepts. These exercises are really meant to help you deepen and expand your knowledge base, to help you see how different ideas and concepts connect with each other. And of course, some of them are pretty calculation heavy. A lot of them require creativity. And some of them will introduce you to concepts and ideas that I didn't get to in the introductory video. So, definitely these are intended for serious players. And if you're newer to chess, please feel free to watch this video just as an instructional video. You don't have to try to solve the exercises. You can solve some of them, but not all of them. And of course, if you have a physical board handy next to you, you can solve these exercises by setting them up on a board. And if some of them are challenging, you can feel free to move the pieces around and just kind of analyze in free-for-all fashion, right? Because a lot of learning in the endgame, it takes place through this seemingly messy and chaotic process of just moving the pieces around and being really confused. And I will try my best to walk you through the solutions and to explain how you can rely on your conceptual knowledge and on your calculation to solve each of these challenging exercises. Okay, having laid the groundwork, without further ado, let's jump in. Let's start with kind of an appetizer round, a simpler exercise that will set the tone. turn your attention to the chessboard. You have the black pieces. You will always face the side that is to move, so you can assume your pawns are going forward. And as a quick reminder, in each of the next 9 exercises, you will be trying to win the game. There will be a third part of the practicum in which the goal will be to hold a draw. But in each of these subsequent exercises, your goal is to win the game, to defeat the enemy army of pawns using your horsey, and to demonstrate the superiority of the knight. Okay, so in this position, it is black to move. Your job is to win the game, and to do so efficiently. Good luck. Buckle your seatbelts. Let's put our endgame caps back on, and let's jump in. Cue the fireworks and champagne sound of pop bottle. Okay, so in the previous video on knight versus pawn endgames, I looked at 2 really fascinating positions. And in one of them, the theme was actually checkmate. In the introductory video as well, I talked about a set of positions where the knight, the king, and sometimes the pawn can combine to spin up a very wide range of mating nets. You don't need a lot of material in order to checkmate the enemy king. And when the enemy king is confined to a corner, you should immediately, the alarm bells should start ringing. And this is a textbook scenario in which white's king is confined to a corner. It's shut out by its own pawn, and it's actually only got one escape square, and that is a2. So the solution here is to deprive the king of its last remaining escape square, and then to quickly and efficiently set up a mating net before white is able to give away both of his pawns and effectuate stalemate, or promote one of the pawns to a queen and eliminate the knight. So the first step, logically enough, is to push the pawn down to b3. Now the white king is completely immobile, and we can switch our attention to setting up the mating net. White has only one legal move, and that is h5. Now, of course, a key concept here is that these pawns are actually helping you. You don't want to automatically eat the pawn, because white's just then going to give up the other pawn, and you will have no choice but to acquiesce to stalemate. You can go knight f6, white's going to promote to a queen, and either you lose the game or you take the queen and it's stalemate. So instead of taking the pawn, you want to focus on setting up the mating net. Now, first thing is to determine the mating square for the knight. Well, that's not hard to see. That square is going to be c2, the square currently occupied by the black king. So the key is going to be to move this king out of the way and then to quickly guide the knight around. You have several ways of doing that over to the c2 square. So the correct move is king c2 to c1, of course, maintaining control of the b1 square. The MUPA, most popular wrong answer, is to start with knight f5. I think it's easy to assume that the order of operations doesn't matter, but in fact it does, because knight f5 releases the blockade of the g-pawn and allows white to play g7, and you're not able to set up the mating net in time. Right? You can go knight e3, but white's going to promote to a queen, and you can't put the knight on top of the king. So here, actually, in order to draw the game, black has to find knight to h6, because if you take the pawn, white pushes h6. This is a concept that you should be familiar with pawn on h6 and a knight on g7, unable to stop the pawn. Here, black actually loses the game. And after knight h6, white draws in familiar fashion, giving up one pawn and then giving up the other pawn. So the correct move here is to start with king c1. Again, white's only legal move is h6. Now, as you can see, the knight has several roads lead to Rome. You can fly through several different airports, but I think the simplest is knight f5. White pushes either of their pawns, for example, g7. Again, you can go knight e3 or knight d4. As long as you hit the c2 square at the end, white actually promotes to a queen, and knight c2 is checkmate. What a beautiful mating net. And it's less uncommon than you might think if you look at this position in a vacuum. And I'm about to prove that to you. But before I do, just notice that the one important thing is to ensure that when white promotes, the queen, the newly promoted queen, does not make contact with the mating square, because this is just an important observation to make. So if white had pushed the h-pawn instead, nothing would have changed. HA queen, knight c2 is still checkmate. So the solution is to play b3, to drop the king out of the way to c1, and then to guide the knight to the mating square on c2. Now, what's fascinating is that en route to Paris from Charlotte, I succumbed to the temptation and paid the exorbitant fee for in-flight Wi-Fi, which of course worked terribly, but it was enough to pass the time along, and I managed to play a couple of decent quality games on chess.com on my phone. And something crazy happened in one of those games. So this position occurred in one of those games against a strong Iranian FIDE master named Artin. I had the black pieces here, and I was soundly outplayed. But in this position, I played the move rook a3 to g3. And suddenly I realized that the situation is becoming rather complicated. White is a queen for a rook and a knight, but white is at serious risk of getting checkmated here, because if the queen moves away, then I can take on g2, and it's checkmate in one move. King h1, knight g3, or king h3, knight g1 is a very pretty mate, with the h4 pawn acting as an obstruction. So it turns out, upon analysis, of course upon landing, that white has to tread a very narrow path in order to win the game. In fact, there are two winning moves in this position. Both of them are really instructive. I think one of them is truly quite beautiful, and it's worth finding. So as a quick bonus exercise, I'm going to flip the board and just, if you so desire, see if you can find one or even both of white's winning moves. As a small hint, white played a tempting move that actually loses the game. Okay, so the key to winning this game is to give the queen up for the rook, but to do so in such a manner as to leave the white king with enough real estate to dodge any nasty knight checks. And this can be done two different ways. I think the most findable move is queen f3 check. That is a badass move. You're sacrificing the queen. Black is forced to take. You simply take back. And this is a textbook example of trousers, which is a concept I introduced in one of the pawn endgame videos. That's where you have passed pawns on either side of the board, and they are totally unstoppable because the knight is a short-range piece. So black can stop the a pawn. Black can go knight d4, a6, knight c6, but then the h pawn is going to seal the deal by a single tempo. I should mention, king takes f3, h6, black steps away, but the f pawn is not in time, and white promotes first. But the important thing to notice here is that white's king is almost out of squares, and so knight takes f3 check might seem nasty, but here the king can go either direction, such as king h1, and black is out of checks and must allow the a pawn to promote. White wins the game on the spot. So this is one winning move. The other winning move is even more badass, and that's queen g4 to g5. This is what's called a collinear move. It's when essentially two pieces are looking at each other, and you're making a move on the same file, but that doesn't capture the enemy piece. Okay, that was a very confusing definition. Forget I said anything, but queen g5 is a pretty sexy move, and the idea is exactly the same. You can't take g2 because that pawn is still defended via the x-ray, and if black takes the queen, white plays h takes g5, you still have trousers, the white king still has plenty of escape squares, and black loses the game pretty straightforwardly. My opponent understood the right idea, but he had the wrong execution. He played queen takes g3, and believe it or not, this is a losing move. I'm going to flip the board back. Now we're going to take my perspective again. And after f takes g3 check, I think you can see where this is going. My opponent drops the king back to h1, thinking that the king is safe from any checks, but this is the identical scenario to the one that you just saw in the exercise. It's just a matter of spinning up the mating net, which is just in time, and it proceeds along identical lines. I started with king f1. At this point, I had those butterflies in my stomach. I was like, wait a second, this is really familiar. White pushes a6, and again, many roads lead to Rome, or Paris in my case. Knight to c3, a7, knight to d1, a8 queen, and knight f2 is checkmate. Now, for extra credit, I would encourage you to figure out the win after king to h3, which is a more resilient move. Black is actually still winning in this position. I'm not going to delve into the winning process here. I'm going to spell it out in the worked solution file on Lichess, so you can click on that and take a look at the winning process and match the solution with yours. But black actually is winning here and in several different ways. But in any case, you can see that the exercises I'm giving you, I'm not just offering whimsical themes that may occur once in a lifetime. These are concepts that are going to occur in your games, and they might occur in a game that you play right after watching the video. So without further ado, first concept, checkmate, even with a single knight and a single pawn on the board, is very possible. Let's move on to the second exercise. And in the second exercise, things are going to get quite a bit more involved. You will again handle the black pieces. This is a pretty high-level game. George Kaltanowski, who has the black pieces here, was an international master. He was known for his blindfold displays. He was able to play many, many games blindfolded at the same time. And in this position, his opponent, Jan Schultz, plays the move king to c4. Approaching the knight with the king, White's mechanism of defense here is very obvious. White is just trying to approach the knight with the king and chase the knight around ad nauseum. This is where knowledge of basic theoretical concepts is really important, because I talked about the scenario with a knight pawn on the 7th rank against the knight in the introductory video. And, being acquainted with how that works will help you streamline your thinking process. Kaltanowski actually was not able to find the narrow winning path. So you have a chance to play better than George Kaltanowski. It's black to play. See if you can generate the winning line. And obviously, the solution should contain more than just one move. You're trying to work this out all the way until it's very obvious that you have succeeded in your goal, that you have won the game. Okay, so first, let's take a look at what happened in the game. Now, a lot of the time that, by the time an endgame like this is reached, the players are in acute time pressure. So my goal is never to disparage the players or the player who was not able to find the solution. To the contrary, it's even more motivation to study the endgame, and it should be pretty encouraging for you to see how often the strongest players aren't able to solve the endgame tasks that are in front of them. Endgames are hard, and mistakes are to be expected. So Kaltanowski played the move g7, g5. And this move really needs no explanation. He's just trying to full send his pawn forward, and he's hoping that the knight will afford him enough time to win the pawn race, but it's a miscalculation, and White actually can draw by taking on passant, but that's actually not even necessary. White draws with the straightforward king to d5, just completing the plan initiated on the previous move. Kaltanowski pushed. White makes contact with the knight, and unfortunately, black is just not fast enough. The pawns will promote simultaneously. Kaltanowski tried knight b8, but this is the perpetual pursuit that I talked about in the introductory video. The knight is unable to buy a single tempo because every time it moves out of the line of fire, the king simply moves back and attacks it again. Kaltanowski pushed g3, king takes b8, g2, but the king steps out of the way just in time. We have simultaneous promotion, and to make matters even worse, it's a set of corner pawns. So maybe Kaltanowski was relying on the queen exchange and had calculated that the pawn endgame was winning, but unfortunately it's not winning. It's a draw by a single tempo. White's king makes it back just in time. King c7, king to d6. You have lateral opposition, which is a bad sign, and here the players agree to a draw. And king g5, king e5, king takes h5. King f5 is a theoretical position that you should be very familiar with. This is a draw. So unfortunately, the move g5 does not lead to the desired result. And the correct approach is actually to ignore the fact that you have this pawn majority and instead to focus on adding a supporter to the knight. The correct move is king to g8, which in and of itself is a pretty mundane move, right? So this might have been on your radar. This might have been the first move, or maybe even the only move that you considered. But the devil here is going to be in the follow-up, right? King g8 itself is pretty obvious, but the cool part of this exercise happens in a couple of moves. This is why it's so important to try to work out your solution as deeply as you can. So white continues along with king to d5. You play king f8 or king f7, and white makes contact with the knight. Now we get to the fun part. So first of all, you have to avoid knight to b8, which is an immediate draw, and instead, the king reaches the knight just in time, king to e8. So the first important concept here is that anytime you can give the knight away for this pawn, black wins the game, because white's king is going to be too far away. Black will have a 2-on-1, and you will just be able to eliminate the h-pawn with your king, or at the very least, trade it off favorably. But white's king is not going to go gentle into that good knight. And white has two serious options here. King e6 is not a serious option because it walks right into a fork. White can play king to c6, trying to maintain opposition. Or white can play king c7, which turns out to be the most resilient move. If white tries to maintain opposition, you are able to use your king and to use a very important tactical concept in order to outmaneuver the white king. Here you start with king e7, and white's only reasonable response is king to c7, maintaining the opposition. If white goes the other way, if white goes king to d5, at this point you've relinquished contact with the knight, and black can win in a variety of ways, such as knight to b8. And if white just tries to sort of chill in the center, you can deliver a check on c6, and whichever way the white king goes, the black king follows it, king to d7, and you're just going to win the b7 pawn. This is not particularly interesting. But of course, white's going to go forward and maintain opposition, and this is where the fourth concept on the right comes into play, using checks/forks to stop promotion. Here, the winning move, the secret sauce, is knight to c5, double exclam. And if white promotes to a queen, the knight circles back to a6, picking off the newly promoted queen, and this works to perfection. You win the h5 pawn and the game. Now, those with a keen tactical eye will have noticed that white can actually make a knight, and white should make a knight, but this does not substantively influence the evaluation. You should kind of sense that after a move like knight e4 or knight e6 check, the h5 pawn is toast, right? White's pieces are on literally the worst possible squares, so black's knight is just going to kind of casually travel to g3, eliminate the h-pawn, and even if white's king were on a desirable square, the 2 against none would still be winning. With white's king as far away as it is, this is a pretty easy conversion. White can give a meaningless check. Black's king just gets out of the way, and then you can round up the pawn either with king g5 or with knight g3. The Lichess solution study has a more fully worked out example of how you would convert the ensuing position, but it's not particularly exciting. So that is how you beat the move king c6. But what if white tries king to c7 first? The reason this is a smart move is because knight c5, first of all, good thought. Unfortunately, b8 is now a check, right? You can never forget to check, no pun intended, whether your opponent promotes with a check. So you have to get your king out of the way, king e7. Now, again, white's king has two different directions. And, I really want to emphasize that at some point, right, to some extent, almost all endgames come down to like rote calculation, right? There's only so much that you can do by applying concepts and, by reasoning logically. At some point, you just need to get, plunge in and get your hands dirty, so to speak. And at some point, you just need to calculate, and oftentimes, by brute force, just, disciplined calculation is one of the things that makes endgames so hard, right? You reach a position like this and you start feeling overwhelmed, like, oh, white has this move and white has that move. There is no science here. You just have to go through each move one by one. This is where visualization really helps, and work out the win. Now, the patterns repeat themselves. If white plays king c6, you move the king up to e6, and after king c7, it doesn't matter where black's king is, you have the same trick, knight to c5, as long as the black king is not on the 8th rank. And again, white should promote to a knight, but black's knight travels around and rounds up the pawn, and if white makes a queen, knight a6 picks up the newly promoted queen and wins the game. So white's going to go down to c8, and this is the main line, which is going to bring to the table yet another really important concept. So in order to make progress, we start shouldering the white king. borrowing a concept for pawn endgames, we move the king up to d6, depriving white's king of the c7 square, so white maintains the opposition with king to d8. Now the key is to drop the knight back to b8, which is a square that was previously inaccessible. And the point is to put white's king in Zugzwang. If white's king moves back to c8, you play knight c6, and white literally has no moves left other than to self-immolate by promoting and walking into this losing pawn endgame. So, again, white's king is going to go the other way, and it's really important not to forget, right, not to get tunnel vision when it comes to your opponent's resources. Oftentimes, you get so bogged down into making sure that the passed pawn is contained that you forget the enemy king can go the other way and target your exposed pawns. So king f7 is a threat that cannot be allowed. Here we play king to e6. Now, if white's king now drops away to d8, we build what I call the force field. And the force field is what's going to win you the game. A better way of seeing the force field is to see what happens after king e6, king f8, attacking the pawn, we play king f6. White goes the other way, king e8. And again, it looks like when all is said and done, white is going to draw in exactly the same manner that he drew in the game. If we push g5, white's going to go king to d8 and king to c7 and set up the perpetual pursuit of the knight. But here the force field comes into play. We can start with g5, but the nicest move here is knight to a6, setting up what I call the force field. And the force field is a unique situation in which the enemy king simply is unable to reach a target square because of the unique placement of our pieces, in this case, the king on f6, which prevents the white king from kind of circumventing the forking square via e7. The moment the king steps onto d7, boom, the landmine is activated. We win the pawn on b7 and win the game. If the white king walks over to c8, well, that doesn't do anything because we are not afraid of white promoting with b8. And this is the force field. Now, of course, you should be able to see what the move is. If white plays king d8 immediately, it doesn't change anything. Here we still play knight a6, covering the c7 square. White has nothing better than to aimlessly wander around on the 8th rank. And here we can win in many different ways, but the easiest is just to put the king on f6. And finally, we are ready to push g5. So for example, if we go back to king f8, king f6, king e8, knight a6, setting up the force field, let's say king d8, we push g5, white takes en passant. Now, white can try, finally, to kind of circumnavigate these landmine squares, but here white is too slow. King e7, h5, king d6, h4, king c6. Finally, white is approaching the knight, but here our pawn is just fast enough. And in this position, one last pitfall to avoid. Right, you can pause the video just to make sure that you have the move right. Here, the knight is able to buy us one more tempo by dropping back to b8. King a7 or king c7. Now we push h2, and we enter a theoretically winning position, which, of course, I haven't talked about explicitly yet, and I will. We will have a whole unit on 7th rank pawn versus queen, but this is a theoretically winning endgame, and you're welcome to prove that to yourself using the engine. The winning process here is pretty simple. Basically, the elevator pitch is you use a series of zigzagging checks to keep forcing the white king in front of the pawn. Right? You're going to keep zigzagging and staircasing the queen until you reach a situation like this. The white king is forced in front of its own pawn. That earns you a tempo that you use to slowly but gradually but surely, that's exactly how Shakespeare wrote it, inch your king toward the enemy pawn, and eventually you round the pawn up, or you set up a mating net. So this was, by the way, not the only way to win the game. You can play king g5 as well, but this is a little bit more involved. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the winning process. So let's go through that one more time from the start. So white plays king to c4. The first step is to avoid the temptation to just automatically push your passed pawn, and instead to use your king as an auxiliary piece to support the knight. Now we get into this fascinating battle of the kings, right? Where white tries to jockey for position. And we use two separate concepts in order to win that battle. The first is one that you're familiar with, right? Using the fork in order to eliminate the enemy pass pawn. Here we play knight to c5 and win the game. The more resilient move, of course, is king c7. And here, in order to win, you need to use the force field. After king c8, we go knight to b8. This is actually also an important move, right? Once the square is available, the target square is going to be a6. That's the force field square. And we set up the force field in this position by playing knight to a6 and ensuring that the d7 square is, as Naroditsky would say, a mined square. There's a landmine that we put on the d7 square. The white king is unable to circumvent those squares and has to grant us enough time after g5, hg, king g6 to push our pawn far enough such that when we do give up the knight, our pawn promotes just in time. King a7, h2, and leads us to a theoretically winning position. So, no, the positions are not ordered by difficulty. I don't really like doing that. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine because that's not, that's not a good real life application, right? Sometimes you have easy tasks that you have to solve at the board. Other times, the task in front of you during a game is pretty Herculean. So these exercises are going to vary in terms of difficulty, and this was a doozy. Okay, moving on to our next exercise. Let's flip the board because this time you will be facing white. This one I think is a little bit easier, a little bit more manageable. Once again, a very strong player, 2250, went wrong in this position. Maybe he was in time pressure. Maybe automatic thinking took over. Either way, this is a really instructive position. It's white to play and win. Again, you're going up. Your pawns are going straight. See if you can improve on Zoran Juric's play. Okay, so first, let's take a look at the game continuation. The automatic move, and this is all about just pulling yourself away from autopilot moves. Another reason that endgames are so hard. Sometimes your intuition is literally screaming for a certain move. It's so natural, and yet your theoretical knowledge and your conceptual knowledge often has to override, that intuitive desire to play a move that quote unquote cannot be wrong. And in this case, that move is a7. I mean, what could be more natural than just pushing the pawn, forcing the black king over to b7, and dropping the knight back to c6? This is what white played, and setting up a seemingly invincible chain. Well, the problem is that, as you should know, and as I introduced in the theoretical introduction, there is a theoretical position that you have to know, which people often forget about, which is a knight, a pawn on the 7th rank, and a king versus king is actually a draw. So let's assume that all of the pawns on the king side were gone. Let's just get rid of them. Blah, blah, blah. Let's just get rid of them. This position is drawn, right? This is a theoretical draw because white simply cannot make progress. And the reason is simple. Anytime the white king approaches the black king, it's going to be stalemate. Your knight is literally tied down to the pawn. White has no way to dislodge the black king from the b7 and a8 squares. And this has cost people a lot of half points. And that is essentially the reason why a7 is wrong. But there's one little twist. After knight to c6, black has to be very careful and very discerning as to how he gives up his kingside pawns. Black's goal is to get rid of white's lonesome pawn, and he's got 3 pawns with which to work. How hard can it be? Well, pretty darn hard, as it turns out. And extra credit to you if you were able to determine that the only way in which black can get rid of the g2 pawn is by starting with e4 check. Once again, the tempting move, the move that your hand wants to make f3, is wrong because white is able to keep the pawn alive with the move g3. And of course, the king handily stops black's 2 passed pawns. Now e4 check is futile, simply king e3. And at this point, this is a moot point because white's not going to rely on the a pawn to win the game. White's going to rely on the g pawn to win the game by just dropping the knight back to e5 and rounding up all 3 of black's pawns, and then the win is straightforward. So the key is to start with e4 check, deflecting white's king onto an inconvenient square. White basically has to take on e4 if white tries to be coy. At this point, the simplest way to draw is just to push g3 and then to push f3 on the next move. If white takes, now and only now do you push f3. Of course, g3 loses the game. After f2, white can't stop the pawn. Here, white has to take gf. Now black simply recaptures, funneling us into the theoretically drawn position. After king a8, white realized what he had done and immediately acquiesced to the draw. So amazingly, a7 does not lead to the desired result. So what on earth can white do instead, because the knight on b8 is hanging? Well, major kudos to you if you were able to figure out that the winning move is knight b8 to d7. This is just a lovely concept. Now, it's obvious why the knight cannot be capped, right? King takes d7, a7. What's awesome about this move is that you are holding your pawn back on a6, right? Violating seemingly the most basic principle. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. Well, those cliches at a high level are extremely dangerous, and you want to apply them very sparingly. Now, in this situation, if black copies the method of giving away all three of his pawns for white's g-pawn, be my guest, right? e4 check, king takes e4, f3, g takes f3. And it's important to note that after g3, king e3, white is able to round up the g-pawn. So gf king takes f3 is winning for white because the pawn is on a6, and black's king is, this is, I would say, a different type of a force field, right? The knight boxes in the black king, and the black king is unable to even make contact with the a-pawn, right? King c6, we just play king e4. King b5 lets the pawn slip through to a7, so white has no choice but to play king c7. Now we shoulder the black king with king d5 and king c6 and force it away from the a-pawn, and we promote the a-pawn and win the game. So this is actually a really nifty construction to internalize the knight on d7 and the pawn on a6. It's not that common, but it's incredibly effective because it's self-sufficient, and you can just calmly bring up the king and deprive the black king of remaining oxygen. Of course, that's not the only way to win. You can also play a knight to c5, and then you can bring the king up. But as a matter of fact, the knight can remain on d7 for the rest of the line. Now, one final detail, if black plays f3, right here, once again, the key is to push g3, much like we did in the incorrect line, because if you play g takes f3, this is a draw not because of anything theoretical, but just because after e4, black builds up these connected passers, and that will keep the white king at bay forever. White is unable to make progress because the moment the knight moves out, the black king is able to step onto b6 and make contact with the a-pawn. So white simply cannot make progress without giving up the a-pawn. So here, once again, the key is to preserve our one remaining kingside pawn. After e4 check, we slide up to e3. And here, just like we did, just like we've already examined, we can just go knight f6, pick up the g-pawn, then pick up the e-pawn, the f-pawn, and the win is pretty elementary. So white wins here by refraining from the temptation to push a7. On the right, you can see theoretical knowledge, a7 pawn plus knight equals draw. That's crucial. The winning move here is the brilliant knight to d7, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, on we go to our next exercise, and this time, once again, you will have the black pieces. This one is an absolute showstopper. Okay, this one you will not forget for a long time. It's pretty incredible. I was really excited when I stumbled upon it. It's not a famous game at all. As you can see, 2250 versus 2150. This is some random Portuguese tournament, I think from like the 90s. Don't ask me how I found this example. Right now, your task is to figure out the winning line for black. And so technically, it's a bishop versus knight endgame right now, but clearly you are going to promote at some point. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I'm not saying you'll promote now. And then, of course, that will funnel us into a more traditional knight versus pawn endgame. This is really awesome. Once again, black missed the winning line in the game. And you really will have to think outside the box and be very creative in order to uncover the winning line. Good luck. Black to play and win. Let's do it. Had to turn the AC on. It's getting hot in here. Okay, so again, it's hard to generate the winning line, all in one fell swoop. And oftentimes, process of elimination is your friend, right? If there's only one possible move in a certain position, you can sort of move first and then think later. And this is a good example of that. The sort of myopic e1 queen actually, well, it doesn't lose the game because after bishop takes e1, you can still save a draw. But if you play knight takes e1, you actually lose. And in order to figure that out without calculating, again, the introductory video would have helped because one of the recurring themes is that the knight is particularly incompetent at stopping corner pawns, just because there is no right side of the board. So the knight really, really struggles here. And here white wins because the red carpet is unrolled and the black king is on a very awkward square. You can convince yourself of this, but the a pawn is simply unstoppable. So you will not succeed in curbing white's corner pawn activity without successfully and very astutely employing your king. So the first step is to lock white's king in with the move king c6. Really common theme, whether you're trying to win the game or save the game, actually whether you have the pawn or whether you have the knight, right? Imprisoning the king in general is a theme that you should be very familiar with because in many cases it's the only way forward. So white has nothing better but to play king a7, trying to open up one more square for the a pawn, and of course opening up an escape route for the white king. Now, I would say that the sort of intuitive approach here is to go king c7 and try to keep the white king locked in. But this is a futile pursuit because, first of all, white can just go back to a6. And technically this is wrong because black can now repeat moves with king c6 and then revert to the correct plan. But just to illustrate, actually, no, this is winning. This is winning. e1 queen here is winning. So, no, here actually white just makes a waiting move, bishop c3. What I wanted to illustrate is that if black promotes in this position, this is a draw, and you should now be pretty well versed in these types of situations where black actually plays for checkmate, but it all depends on where the knight initiates its journey, because white's strategy here is going to be to self-imprison the king and try to quickly exhaust his legal moves and force stalemate. So white will play a6, and you might remember that the target square in such positions is b5, and unfortunately, black is one tempo shy of that square. Knight to c2, king to a8. If black's knight were on b5 in this position, then after king c8, it would be forced mate, right? a7, and then knight b5 to c7. That was essentially the subject of the entire previous video. Here, black is not in time. Right? Knight b4, a7, and the game is over. It's a draw. Because if you step away, white actually wins the game by promoting. So king to c7, as tempting as it is wrong. The correct move here is now to promote to a queen and to get a classic knight versus pawn endgame. Now the fun begins. And again, it's important in these types of situations not to get overwhelmed and to realize that calculation is actually at its core, a pretty straightforward process, right? But it's a process that requires discipline. So it's made harder if you're trying to visualize the position. If you made the moves on the board, then you should just sort of separate the calculation by white's possible defensive methods here, right? So white can play either a6, trying to lock himself in the cage, or white can try to make a run for it with king to b8. You take one move at a time, and it's just very important to keep those separate strands separated in your mind, because calculation is harder. Obviously, the more options are available for your opponent, and it's very easy to get confused and to forget what you've already calculated. So that's why I like going one by one. Okay, so king to b8, as it turns out, is the easier move to calculate. Here, it's important only to be familiar with the ideal formation. And I forgot to include it in the list on the right, but the ideal formation is a setup with the knight guarding a pass pawn from behind so that if the knight is captured by the enemy king, the pass pawn shoots forward and is unstoppable. So here, it's just a matter of dividing labor, right? The a pawn is going to be stopped by the black king. The knight is going to win the h pawn and quickly set up the ideal formation. Now don't fall asleep because white's threatening a6. So first things first, we got to go king b5. White makes a run for the h-pawn. Now here you can start with king takes a5. You can start with knight f3. It doesn't matter. King takes a5 is the most straightforward. King to d6, knight f3. White continues to run for the h-pawn. King e6, knight takes h4, but he is not quite in time. And the winning move here, the only winning move, is the brilliant knight to g6. If you're familiar with the ideal formation, this is pretty intuitive. And again, after king g5, h4, the ideal formation is reached. The knight guards the pawn from behind. If white goes king g4, the black king slowly inches its way around to the king side, and the win is elementary. And of course, otherwise, the h-pawn simply promotes. The wrong approach here would be to move the knight forward to f3. This might seem tempting because it keeps g5 under control, but actually it relinquishes the win. King f5, and okay, h4, king g4 is obviously a draw. And here white chases the knight away. The knight has no square such that it will be able to then guard the h5 pawn after king to g5. So white makes a pretty straightforward draw. So the winning idea here is knight to g6, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so we examined one of white's defensive approaches, which is to use the a-pawn as a decoy and try to make a run for black's other pawn. Now we examine white's second approach, which is to use the a-pawn as the main defensive resource. a6, this is what happened in the game, and this is actually where black faltered in the game. Black played the move knight to c2, okay, which gives away the win for a pretty straightforward reason. White now plays king to b8, and that's it. Black plays knight b4. Now, black's knight does successfully reach the c7 square, which is what black was hoping for. But after king c8, knight c7, it's not hard to see that black simply cannot make progress. And, you've seen examples like this as well, where basically the enemy king just has too many waiting squares. So you're unable to shoulder it away from, essentially these three squares highlighted in red. It doesn't matter who has the opposition, right? King d6, white can go king c8 or king b7. White's king just basically chills, between these three squares, and there's nothing that black can do. If the knight moves around to b6, white promotes to a queen. White has diagonal opposition, and much like the Kaltanowski example, the king is just in time to make its way to the promised land and secure the draw. As a matter of fact, white can actually go king to d8 in this situation and make a run for the h-pawn as well. So this clearly is not a serious winning attempt. Black, of course, must have thought that king to b8 is coming. So if anything, black needs to think about saving the game. But kudos to you if you were able to find the initial improvement, which is to keep the king locked in with king to c7. Okay, so again, this is just step one. White is forced to play king a8. And again, you would be wrong to think that the main theme here is checkmate, right? This is the hard part. You've seen examples time and time again where the knight is able to reach a mating square. But in real chess, as my coach used to say, right? In real life chess, there are a lot of red herrings, right? There are a lot of situations where you think that one theme should be applied, right? This is exactly what I saw in, the Naroditsky instructional video. But then you start looking and you're like, well, the knight is on the wrong square, right? If the knight was like shifted one square down or one square to the right, you might have been able to set up checkmate. As it stands, the knight is unable to reach the b6 square in time. All right, knight to d3, a7, and it's a draw because black is forced to allow stalemate. But this position is winning. And it's winning because of an absolutely incredible concept that I have really only seen in Puzzle Rush. I have seen this concept in the more advanced Puzzle Rush puzzles on chess.com. And once I've set this position up, most of you with a keen tactical eye should start to suspect that this pair of pawns might have something to do with the winning process. So I'll give you another opportunity in case you were not able to reach this position in your calculation. See if you can figure out the unbelievable show-stopping winning idea at black's disposal here. So the correct approach is to start with knight f3. And here's the thing. If white continues to shuffle his king, now you actually can set up the mating net, right? Now the knight travels back to e5, around to c4. Again, the point is to be able to meet a7 with knight b6, and back down to c8, which should be a pretty habitual target square for you because this controls a7 and controls b6 at the same time. So a7, knight b6 is mate. Of course, white's not going to do that. White's going to go a7. And now comes the showstopper, knight f3 to g5. I love this move. And you certainly cannot blame black for not seeing this all that way back. This forces white to play h takes g5 and triggers a pawn race. White wins the pawn race. White promotes first, but black promotes with check, right? So a concept that you might have, consigned to the backwater of your brain, checking zone, right? If you watch the video on pawn races, you should remember checking zone. When you're evaluating pawn races, it's not just about who promotes first, but you have to see where the kings are located and if either of the kings are located on a square such that the queen promotes with check, or the pawn promotes with check. It does in this case. And after h4, g6, h3, g7, h2, g8, what's crazy is you actually can make a bishop. That's what I'll do. You make a bishop, mandatory, right? Forced, queen g2, bishop takes g2, mate. You can also make a queen. But this is absolutely mind-blowing. Knight to g5 is the secret sauce. And because of the unique arrangement of the pieces, because black's king is on c7 rather than c8, right? If black's king had been on c8, this actually would have lost the game because white would have promoted with check. And this is why endgames are just stochastic in nature, right? A lot of ideas in the endgame, unlike the middle game, occur because of the coincidental arrangement of pieces. And you really have to understand and appreciate that. Again, like conceptual knowledge is limited in scope. You can know all the concepts and all the theoretical positions, but you have to recognize and appreciate that a lot of endgame mastery is just about understanding how each piece placement, how each pair of seemingly irrelevant pawns influences the position, right? And takes us away from a more textbook theoretical position you might be familiar with, right? So in this case, the presence of the pawns on h5 and h4 is what grants black the ability to play knight to g5. So this is why those who are oriented toward detail and who see every single pair of pawns, every single small detail on the board, those are the true endgame masters. And I don't consider myself among them. Knight to g5, ladies and gentlemen, is the winning idea. Black wins the pawn race and delivers checkmate, potentially with a single bishop. And so the winning approach here is to start by building the cage, not to continue keeping the white king in a cage, but instead to now promote. Here, white is unable to make a run for the pawn because of the ideal formation, so a6 is resilient. Now you rebuild the cage with king c7, giving you enough time to either travel around in the event of king a7 to the target square on c8, or in the event of a7, to trigger this incredible pawn race with the move knight to g5. So I hope you enjoyed this position. We move on. I see we're about 54 minutes into the video, so I'm going to try to keep this under 90 minutes. The practicum videos are long, and there's nothing wrong with starting this and doing a few exercises and then coming back to it. I like to record one video per practicum just to avoid clutter. But I know these are long, so if you're still with me, if you're still solving, big kudos to you. And remember that perseverance and the ability to sit through a series of complex positions, it builds stamina. That in and of itself is improving your endgame ability as well. Let's flip the board and let's examine a position that comes from a game between two very strong GMs. Ilya Smirin is actually currently playing in the Olympiad in Budapest for Israel. Simbat Liputian, now retired, is an Armenian grandmaster. He was many, many times top board for Armenia in the Olympiad. Super strong player. And they reached this very unique knight versus pawn endgame. You are Simbat Liputian. Well, maybe Simbat is watching this video as well. Your job is to defeat Smirin with an incredible series of moves. White to play and win. Let's go. If you've perused the list of concepts on the right, there might be one of them that you read and you're just like, WTF, what does this have to do with anything? What does this mean? And that is the phrase, kill your darlings. Actually, this phrase was introduced to me by my 10th grade English teacher. Obviously, it was not in reference to chess. It was in reference to proper essay writing technique. You're like, I can see you rolling your eyes, but just bear with me. The phrase stuck with me because my English teacher, she said that very often what holds back a writer from putting out a successful piece of writing, whether an essay or a book, is being overly attached to like a certain sentence or even sometimes a certain character, and sometimes not seeing that sentence structure or that character is holding you back and actually preventing you from fleshing out an otherwise good idea. And something similar actually happens in chess. Very often we look at a position and within a couple of moments we decide what the heroes of the position are. What are the pieces and pawns that you under no circumstances are allowed to give up? And of course, this can hold you back in a big way. This can also win you the game, right? If we come back to this position, it's very important to identify the hero because in the case of f3, you actually need to keep the g-pawn in order to win the game. But the converse of this is also true. You have to remember that flexibility is crucial, and you never know within just a couple of seconds where the win is going to come from and who the hero is going to be. So in this case, you literally have to kill your darlings in order to win the game. So what's going on in this position? Well, again, you can see the knight on b3, the pawn on a5. White has set up an ideal formation on the queen side. It's just a matter of eliminating these pesky 3 pawns on the king side, kind of a familiar scenario. And you can't do it with king takes f5 because after h3, black draws the game immediately. To stop the pawn, white has to move the knight away, and that means giving up your last pawn. So you can't do it, in boorish fashion. You need a little bit of subtlety. And so the only chance that you have of winning this game is to kill your darling, to give up the a pawn, and to find a way to preserve the g-pawn without allowing black to promote. So the most straightforward way of doing that, and the move that I think most of you either selected as your solution or definitely was on your radar, is knight to d4 check, just going after the f-pawn. But this leads to a really interesting geometric kind of situation, tragically for white. After king takes a5, knight takes f5, black plays h3. And even though white now has, his entire army seemingly where it needs to be, to preserve the g-pawn, you have to take away the g3 square from the knight. This actually loses the game because white is unable to stop the pawn with knight g3. So here white has no choice but to give up his last remaining pawn. And so the key here is to understand that f5 is not the correct square. You have to identify a square for the knight such that in response to h3, you can play the move g3, and then in response to h2, the knight is somehow still able to stop the pawn. Now, mathematically, there's only one square that satisfies this criteria, right? It can't be g3, because that's where we will put our pawn. That square has to be f2. So the white knight has to be guided around to f2 quickly, right? So that h3 can be met with g3. Well, how do we do that, right? Maybe knight c5 comes to mind, but no, here black can just play king takes c5. You need to do it in a smarter fashion. You need to do it by killing your darlings with a6, deflecting the king away from b5. Right? But this isn't really deflection in its pure form. The point is that after king takes a6, you are able to deliver a check on c5 and get the knight where it needs to be just in time. Knight to d3. And now, of course, if h3, we play g3, and after h2, knight f2, the knight stops the pawn, and we're able to chop off black's remaining pawns and then go after the h-pawn. That is the winning approach. Now in the game, black played king to c4 in this position. Again, the knight moves back to f2, its target square. Again, h3 is met with g3, and in this position, black resigned after h3, g3. Now there's a little bit of subtlety left to demonstrate if black plays king to d4. You have several winning approaches. I think the nicest is king takes f5. While we're at it, another concept to remember is that the knight can be given away in many cases to liquidate to a winning pawn endgame, right? This is the advantage of having an extra knight. In many cases, you can give that knight away either for an important tempo or in order to eliminate the enemy pawns and transition to a winning pawn endgame. In this case, king takes g4. Simple enough. And this is obviously a easily winning pawn endgame. The pawn is in front of the black king. By the way, you can also win with the preemptive knight h1 and then just mopping up the f and g pawns. So one more clarification I wanted to make. If black plays king to b6, right, kind of a savvy move trying to ensure that knight c5 doesn't come with a check, you still play knight to c5. Again, reaching an ideal formation. And flexibility, right? I've been saying this word several times throughout this video. Really important when you're devising the winning strategy to realize that if your opponent changes their defensive approach, often at the drop of a hat, you then have to change your winning strategy as well. So here after h3, clearly you cannot go g3 anymore. But because you have an ideal formation, now you can play g takes h3 and just mop up black's pawns with your king. And because the pawn hasn't reached a7, this is theoretically winning. Okay, so here after knight to c5, black can also try g3, threatening h3. Now you can just drop the king back to f3. And here again, right, now you still have your g-pawn. Boom, change the strategy, kill your darlings, go around and just win all three of black's pawns with your knight. Okay, so the winning strategy here, the only winning move, is to play a6 in order to get your knight to its target square, right? Building that roadmap and using logic here and essentially being unfettered in your thinking, right? Not ruling out a move because it gives away the pride of your position. That's super important. And that is what allowed Laputian to win this game with a6. Again, I want to keep this video to a reasonable length, so we might not be able to get to all 9 positions. So I think we're going to do 2 more positions, and then I'll save the other 2 for a later video, or I'll put them in the Lichess study. But I think we'll limit ourselves to 7 positions. I don't think anybody will complain. Let's start with this one. Okay, so currently White's king is in check. I am aware of that. In this position, again, a completely unknown game. Ignore the ratings of the players. I don't think those are those are accurate. White played the move king takes h6. And in this position, black has a winning approach that's really, really instructive, and it exploits a concept that I think is among the most misunderstood of all the concepts and notions in knight versus pawn endgames. Like, this is the one that trips players up probably the most, and I'm not going to say what it is. Instead, I'm going to pass it off to you, black, to play. See if you can devise the winning approach here. Again, your goal is to calculate and write out the variations to the very end until it's clear that you're winning. Okay, so the prevailing concept here, and the one that trips up players of all levels, is what I call division of labor. And we talked about this in the previous practicum, and it's very pertinent when you have the knight and the king. Essentially, you often get a situation where you have more than one task, right? In this case, you clearly need to stop the h-pawn, and if black wants to win the game, then at some point you're probably going to have to win the a-pawn as well. And it seems very logical that, well, the knight is closest to the h-pawn and the king is closest to the a-pawn, so that should be black's division of labor, and that is what trips a lot of players up. Oftentimes they make this assumption that the piece that is closest to a pawn should be the one that is whose primary duty it is to prevent that pawn from moving forward, and that is not a sufficiently concrete approach, right? Again, that relies on kind of a cliche and overly generalistic way of looking at the position, and this is why endgames are so complicated. So in the game, black plays a move which, 99% of us would probably play in an instant. Knight takes g4 check. What could be more natural than just eliminating a pawn with check, especially because the knight now controls the h6 square, and yet this move relinquishes the win. After king to g6, black goes after the a-pawn, and again, understanding how bad knights are at stopping corner pawns is important here. Black drops back to h6, white casually picks up the f-pawn, and again we have a case of perpetual pursuit. where even though this pawn is still on the 5th rank, it doesn't matter because as a corner pawn, black is unable to generate a single tempo with the knight because the knight gets pursued with every move. King to f5, knight h6, king to g6, and black tried king b5, but here the pawns essentially, well, they don't promote simultaneously, but white actually reaches a theoretically drawn endgame after king to g7, a3 h6, a2 h7, black promotes with check. But again, we'll get to this in some later videos, but corner pawn on the 7th rank against a queen when the king is sufficiently far enough is a draw because of the role that stalemate plays, right? If you try to apply the same winning process, the king is basically going to hide in front of the pawn, and you're never going to have the time to inch your king forward because this is going to lead to stalemate. So you're going to have to keep moving your queen around, and you can never make progress. So this is how the game ended. I should just point out that if knight g8, white keeps pursuing the knight. Here, the only pitfall for white, of course, is not to play h6 and walk into knight f5, but instead to go king f6 or king f7 and just go ring around the rosy with the knight. So that is how the game concluded and how I think most of us would proceed. But black actually is winning here with a move that in and of itself doesn't look all that special, but if you have the presence of mind to play this move, then you're really an endgame master. The point is, the division of labor has to be flipped. The way to win the game is to assign to the black king the task of stopping the h-pawn, and to assign to the knight the task of winning the a-pawn, exactly the reverse of what you think is logical. And the way to do that is to play king to d5 in this position, just ignoring the hanging pawn on g4 because it's much more important to get the black king where it needs to go. So white's only reasonable move here is actually to push g5, because if white moves the king up, then after knight takes g4, it's very obvious that white has wasted a tempo, and white's king is unable to reach f5 in time. Here, black wins straightforwardly just by promoting the f-pawn. So white has to play g5. Now again, the tempting move is knight f7 check, and again, this is wrong because it wastes time, and after king takes f6, again, black is unable to win the game because the h-pawn is too far advanced. So the winning idea here is to play f takes g5 and to simply continue with king to e6. Division of labor. Now the h-pawn is successfully curbed by the black king after h6, king f7. The king is in the box. And just like the example we saw earlier, all right, the crazy knight g5 example, right, there was a line, and I know that I'm kind of shuffling between examples quickly, but I think you'll thank me for this, just because it's exactly the same concept, right? There was a line where white played king to b8, and black was able to pick up the h-pawn and establish the ideal position just in time. This is the same exact concept. Let's go back to the initial position, king h6, king d5, g5, takes, king e6, h6, king f7. White has to make a run for the a-pawn, but the knight is fast enough. Knight c4, king e4, knight to b6. Right now, king d4, knight takes a4 is essentially a force field. So white can try king e5, doesn't matter. It's all the same because after king to d5, you actually have a tempo to spare. You can play king g6, or you can set up the ideal formation right now with a4. And at this point, the win should be very straightforward. You round up the h-pawn and win the game. That is how you win. Now, in this position, if white eschews h6 and instead makes a run for it immediately, it doesn't change anything. Here again, you have to resist the temptation to stop the h-pawn with the knight and instead go after the a-pawn with the knight. White's only trap here is to try king to g5. Right here, you don't want to play the ignorant knight c5 because that allows king g6, and again, white is able to establish lateral opposition and make a draw. You need to invest a tempo to stop the h-pawn with your king. And if king h6, it's a good idea just to go king g8, shutting down any attempts that white has at self-imprisonment. But that's beside the point. If king e3, again, you are just in time to set up the ideal formation with knight b6 and a4. And that is the winning strategy. What makes this difficult, right? Again, that's a question I like to ask myself because it can teach you a lot about avoiding pitfalls because you identified like the warning signs of improper thinking. When you have a scenario with multiple corner pawns, right, you have to understand what the division of labor should be, and you should never assume that just because the king is closest in this case to the a pawn, then the king should go after the a pawn and the knight should stop the h pawn. Right? Knights can be a lot faster and more nimble than they appear, and I think there's something really paradoxical about this position in particular, where it seems like white's king is so close to eliminating the a pawn, and black's knight is in time to win the a pawn, drop back, and set up the ideal position, all before white's king is able to reach the b5 square. Okay, which is why you have to be so concrete. You have to calculate this stuff out. And so the winning approach here is proper division of labor. The king stops the h pawn, and the knight goes after the a pawn, which is sort of the reverse of what you might think. Boom. Okay, let's conclude with a position that I'm pretty passionate about. I think it'll be a nice sort of final course. It's a little bit more tame, and it really displays and demonstrates a couple of more positional concepts, because a lot of these exercises have been largely tactical in nature. This one is a little bit more conceptual and positional. So it's a game between two Russian GMs. And in this position, black has 3 pawns for the knight. It's a draw. Black can draw the game with proper play, but black acts impulsively and plays the move h4, which on the surface looks like a very logical move. You're trying to carve out a path to f4 for black's king, and it's not clear off the top of your head, is white playing for a win? Is white playing for a draw? In fact, white is playing for a win, and white is winning, but only with a highly accurate and honestly brilliant series of moves that, again, dispels the narrative that knights are always bad or always incompetent at stopping past pawns. There's a lot that the knight can do. There's a lot that the knight is capable of. It's a magical piece, right? And without the knight, chess would not be chess. And I think this endgame really illustrates that like no other. It's white to play, and it should be obvious to you what choice you're trying to make here, right? You're trying to choose between g takes h4 and g4. One of those moves draws, the other one wins. Final exercise for this video. Take a stab at it, expend your last bit of energy, and see if you can find the winning idea. First, let's take a look at the wrong strategy. The wrong move is g takes h4. And it's not hard to determine that after king f4, it's going to be a draw pretty quickly. And the reason is simple. It's the vulnerable nature of this h4 pawn. It's the fact that anytime white's king is going to drop back, black's king is going to slide over to g4 and eliminate white's last remaining pawn. So it almost doesn't matter where white's knight goes. White is the one who needs to be careful here. For example, knight c4, e3, threatening e2. The king has to drop back, and at a minimum, black can play king to g4 and draw the game. So the first pitfall is to recognize that g4 is white's only attempt at winning the game, because the g4 pawn is just much better defended. It's literally defended by the king, and it's currently defended by the knight. So black, of course, slides the king in to f4. And this really is the critical position of the exercise, because you have to decide where the knight is going to go. And again, it's a battle between your kind of logical system 2 brain and then your animalistic, like, let's go for the intuitive square brain, right? I think the intuitive square is usually the center, right? You want to put the knight in the center, but remember that a lot of endgames have nothing to do with these like middle game principles, right? This is a middle game principle that tells you knights are best placed in the center. And of course, there are plenty of endgame scenarios, where the knight is best placed in the center. But here, the task is completely different. It doesn't matter how many squares on the queen side the knight is controlling. Knight d5 actually loses the game, because after king f3, you reach a scenario that I talked about at length in the introductory video, where the king and the knight are diagonally situated with one square between them. The knight is completely dominated by the king, and black just pushes e3 and wins the game, because the knight will have to give itself up for the e-pawn, and black will win because he's got another e-pawn. Okay? So the correct move here is actually knight e3 to g2. And not only is this the only winning move, but it's the only move that doesn't lose the game. Knight g2 really showcases some incredible geometry. The point, of course, is to dissuade black from inching forward into white's territory. After king f3, you capture on h4 with check. This, I think, is the prettiest line. Black continues to move forward to f2. And as though nothing's the matter, you continue to pick up black's pawns. Knight takes g6. And again, just avoiding and beating all odds, white's knight is in time to collect all of black's pawns and still move back to d3 just in time to prevent the e-pawn from promoting. And here again, knowledge of theoretical positions is important. With a b-pawn, black's king would be able to perpetually pursue white's knight. But as I discussed, with a center pawn, the knight is able to continually buy tempi that you can then use to push the g-pawn. So for example, after king f2, you don't go knight d3, you go to c2. Now, in this case, you could go to g2, but the point I'm trying to make is that here you have essentially a force field where the black king is unable to access the knight because king f3, you go knight d4 and eliminate the pawn. And if king f1, well, you don't care, you just push the g-pawn. All of that is a moot point here. You don't even need to play knight d4. I just want to illustrate a clearer application of the force field. So here the winning move is knight to c2. And so what we have determined is that after knight h4, king f2 loses the game. And therefore, king f3 loses the game. So in the game, Serper, or Chuchulov rather, it's like, wait a second, I can't go forward. So he goes back in order to preserve his g-pawn. White takes on h4, and black pushes e3, and this should have been your main line. And here, it's time for some positional brilliance. The first step is to slide your king up to g3, claiming opposition and sealing off the invasion route of black's king. Black pushes e2. Now, actually, there are two winning moves, and they essentially lead to the same position. The simplest is to deliver a check on f3, throwing back black's king. This allows your own king to move back to f2, targeting the e-pawn. Of course, the goal in all of this is going to be to preserve the g-pawn. This pawn has to be kept alive because it's your last pawn. Black has nothing better than to push the other e-pawn forward and try to reopen the path to g5, and here you have to find an only move. Again, the point is the knight has to remain on such a square, on a square such that the white king will be able to move up to g3 if necessary, which eliminates every move other than the correct one, knight e1. If you move the knight to any old square, black can just go e1, deflecting the king, and king g5 picks up white's last remaining pawn. So the correct move here is knight to e1, right? Temporarily making the knight passive, but the point is after king to g5, you play king to g3. And I want you to pause here for a second and appreciate how cool this position is. Why is this position cool? Because black is in Zugzwang. And if black was able to pass the move and avoid making any moves, it would be a draw. White actually cannot make progress on his own, right? Because white just can't do anything, right? The f3 square is controlled. White can just go knight g2, knight e1. But because it is black to move, black has to either give up the f4 square by moving the king back. This is obviously losing. And we'll get to this in a second. After e3, you still need to be very careful. Or actually, no, this is just winning. King takes e3, king to g5, king f3, king h4. Yeah, and here you can give another check on g2, again using the fork to force the king back because king h3, you have knight f4. But this is not important. The important part is either black has to move the king back or black has to move the e-pawn forward, which grants white a crucial square on f3 for the knight, which again pushes the king back, which again allows white's king to move forward. And now this triggers a chain reaction. Black will lose both of his pawns, one after the other. And you're actually going to do the same thing again. e2, king f3, king g5, knight g2, Zugzwang again. Again, black has to move the king back. Now you win the second pawn, and the rest, the conversion here is obviously very, very easy. So in the game, instead of king to g5, black played king to e5. And here you have the exact same thing on the other side of the board. King to e3. Again, black has no way forward and has to abandon the e5 square. Black exhausts his last waiting move. White responds with a waiting move of his own. And here Chuchulov resigned for exactly the same reason. He has to give up one e-pawn, then the other will go for exactly the same reason. He has to move his king. You come back around for one pawn. And then at this point, all of the invasion routes are sealed off, so the knight can just maneuver itself around and pick up black's last e-pawn. That is how you win the game. Let's go through that one more time very quickly. So the first step is to push g4, right? Putting the pawn on as well defended of a square as possible. Now the knight slinks back to g2 with check. The point being to embark on a route where you're able to capture all of black's pawns in the event of king f3, which is really cool. There is actually one other line. If black goes king to e3 and tries to like circle around to d4, here you can just win by going king g3 and king f3. Here is really nothing special. And again, black is at a standstill because king d3 allows knight takes e5 with check. Okay, so just for the sake of completeness. Here, you're able to capture all of black's pawns and live to tell the tale with knight to d3. So the king has to move back. Here you use an altogether different set of tools. And really the only tool that you're using is Zugzwang. e3, sliding over the king, moving back the knight, and now moving back the king, and moving the king back to g3. This is the critical position where black is in Zugzwang, because either black has to allow the king to infiltrate f4, or black has to give up the f3 square, which essentially leads to the same result. Now, I don't think I did as good of a job of explaining that as I would at the beginning of the video, but I think you get the point. Also, this shows the importance of not being overly materialistic, right? You don't just want to grab any pawn that's available. Here, the reason this doesn't work, by the way, is not only is the h-pawn more vulnerable, but you're unable to play knight h4 check, right? This is the physical reason why g4 is correct, because you have to leave an enemy pawn on h4 so that it can be captured because you can't take your own pawns. And so with g4, white is able to win the game. As you can see, Zugzwang, above division of labor, is the prevailing theme in this example. Prophylaxis in unlikely situations is the subject of the last exercise, which I will leave for the next video. And there's also one other position supplied to me by my good friend Alexander Bortnik, which I don't want to hurry you up on. I want to give it the attention that it deserves. So we got through 7 positions, 7.5 with the bonus example, which I think is pretty successful. I will simply append the final 2 exercises to the next video, which will feature less exercises. There, your goal will be to make a draw. You will be trying to save the game, and you will still have the knight and our pawns. But it's been a pretty long video, so let's wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. I'm going to run through the exercises very, very quickly and highlight the key themes. We started with sort of the appetizer round, which spotlighted the importance of not forgetting about checkmate, even with scant material remaining on the board. b3 sets up the mating net. I showed you how I was able to win a game in a very similar fashion just a week or so ago while on a plane. Then we took a look at the Kaltanowski example, where you have to resist the urge, to make the autopilot move, which is a big theme, and use your king as an auxiliary defensive piece, and then use several important concepts such as using the fork to eliminate the newly promoted queen, and also setting up the force field. Then we looked at this example. To solve this, you need to know one of the most important theoretical positions, which is that a pawn on the 7th plus knight, if it's a corner pawn, is a draw, resisting the urge to play a7, and also maintaining pawns on the board when necessary, right? g3 is the only winning move in this position. Then we took a look at this absolute showstopper. Again, several concepts are implicated here. The first is strategically imprisoning the enemy king, but not doing it for too long. And recognizing that when when there's a set of corner pawns that are left, the enemy often has sort of two plans. The first is self-imprisonment, where you basically try to shove the pawn down to a7 and force stalemate. The second is to use the a-pawn as a decoy and run the king around, eliminating your last pawn. I showed that black has an antidote to both of those plans. Ideal formation is very important here, and realizing that the knight is a lot more limber than it appears. You're able to capture the pawn and set up the ideal formation in time. And of course, the showstopper here is after a6. You don't play knight c2. Instead, you win the game with this incredible knight g5 move, setting up a pawn race that results in checkmate because of the checking zone. Then we looked at the kill your darling game, where you have to be ready to give up potentially any element of your position, even a pawn that you think might be the winning pawn. You have to be ready to give it up at a moment's notice, and also the importance of target squares, right? Of course, recognizing your opponent's threat, and then realizing where the knight has to be in order to disarm that threat. Here, the move is a6. If black does not take the pawn, then indeed, this is the darling, right? This is going to be the winning pawn. If black takes, the darling is going to be the g pawn. So flexibility in your approach is really important. Here, the knight is on a perfect square. Finally, we looked at our last two examples. Here, division of labor, which has been a subject in the previous practicum as well, where you had to save a game by dividing labor between the king and the pawns. Here, division of labor is very counterintuitive. The king has to stop the h pawn, and the knight has to win the a pawn if black wants to win this game. And you do that by moving the king down to f7 and then winning the pawn and setting up the ideal formation. Finally, we finished on a positional example where first you have to resist the temptation to take the pawn, and then really the magic of the knight in close quarters is showcased, how you're often able to win an exorbitant amount of pawns and still return to the right square at the right time. Do not underestimate the power of the knight, despite, a lot of the trolling that we do and a lot of the knight's shortcomings, which I like to reveal, and there are a lot of them. The knight can be a really crappy piece, but it can also be a magical piece. And of course, Zugzwang. That's going to be an ever-present theme in every type of endgame that we examine, right? Zugzwang is going to be ever-present. In pawn endgames, it's really central. In knight versus pawn endgames, it can also rear its head, as it does in this situation. Remember, sometimes you can't make progress on your own, but the fact that it's your opponent's move is really important because that opens up the doors of progress. And that, folks, is where we will pause for today. This has been a long video. Once again, you can review the solutions by clicking the solution file linked in the description. Hopefully the next video, which will be part 3, the final part of our knight versus pawn practicum, will be a little bit shorter. After that video, we will move on to knight versus knight endgames, which is a whole different can of worms. So you have a lot to look forward to, but I have a lot of material already prepared, and I'm going to try to rattle off a few of these endgame videos consecutively. So I just want to thank everybody from the bottom of my heart for all of your really wholesome feedback on the endgame series. I know that these are difficult videos to digest. This is tough. It's tough to sit through a video like this, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I appreciate people approaching these videos like true chess professionals. This community is awesome, and I love making these videos, and a big reason why is I know that they help people get better at endgames, and I know that people are doing their very, very best to approach them seriously. So thank you, everybody, for watching. I will see you in the next endgame video, and keep crushing with your knight. These knights. See you in the next video. Bye.